there are always going to be moments where you feel music, as though a story being told about some caricature of you that has nothing to do with you. Music. Music. Was everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle wrong from the start? This question shot through social networks, newsrooms, and comment sections within hours after a series of seemingly innocuous photos triggered an avalanche. Images that were actually meant to accompany the launch of a new lifestyle project became the spark that ignited a scandal that went far beyond mere appearances. Because suddenly it was no longer about fashion, self-realization, or brand building, but about numbers, documents, and the credibility of a woman whose life has been under constant scrutiny for years. The starting point was photos that showed Meghan Markle in a deliberately natural look. Soft light, subtle makeup, a smile meant to convey approachability. But instead of admiration, irritated reactions dominated. Commentators focused not on the message, but on details. Skin texture, facial contours, signs of aging. Within a very short time, a dangerous undertone emerged. Whether this appearance truly matched the officially known birth year of 1981, a question that initially seemed like superficial speculation, quickly took on a different dimension. The debate finally shifted dramatically when the name Tom Bower entered the picture. The investigative journalist, known for his uncompromising methods, shifted the focus away from subjective impressions and toward verifiable documents. Suddenly, the focus was no longer on photographs, but on old administrative documents from the early stages of Meghan Markle's Hollywood career. These documents allegedly listed a different birth year, 1977. A difference of 4 years, which in the entertainment industry can mean the difference between success and obscurity, but in the context of the monarchy, it had a completely different explosive potential. The dynamics of the reporting changed abruptly. Media outlets that had previously focused on style and impact now began asking specific questions. Why were there discrepancies in her birth year? Was it ever officially corrected? And most importantly, what role did the palace play when Meghan Markle married into the British royal family? A discussion about her age had escalated into a credibility crisis. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on the Duchess of Sussex's inner circle. With each passing hour, comments, analyses, and speculation multiplied. Supporters accused critics of age discrimination and a targeted smear campaign. Skeptics felt vindicated and demanded transparency. In this heated atmosphere, Prince William increasingly became the focus of attention, not as her brother, not as a private individual, but as a key figure within the institution of the monarchy, because the question was no longer about Meghan Markle's actual age. The crucial question was whether a potential discrepancy between earlier statements and later official documents could undermine the integrity of the royal vetting processes. Should conflicting data emerge, not only would an individual be under suspicion, but the entire system of control and legitimacy upon which the monarchy rests. Kensington Palace initially reacted with conspicuous restraint. No emotional denial, no personal defense, no direct confrontation with the allegations. This silence acted as a vacuum, creating space for speculation. Observers interpreted it as calculated, critics as an admission of guilt, and supporters as tactical waiting. One thing was certain. Every additional hour without a clear assessment reinforced the impression that more was at stake than a few years' difference on paper. At the same time, it became clear how thin the line is between private past and public responsibility. What was considered standard practice in Hollywood to secure roles was now being re-evaluated in light of state and institutional standards. Meghan Markle's transformation from actress to duchess had changed the rules. What had been a potential career survival strategy had become a potential problem for the credibility of the crown. At the end of this first act, the public was more divided than ever. Some saw a woman once again the target of relentless campaigns. Others saw unanswered questions. One thing was certain. With the emergence of the old documents, a point had been reached where mere silence could no longer be considered neutrality. The affair had only just begun, and it promised to delve far beyond superficialities. With the appearance of the contradictory documents, the focus of the reporting definitively shifted from speculation to underlying structures. The question was no longer whether Meghan Markle appeared older than she had stated, but rather how reliable the newly surfaced evidence actually was. At the center of it all was Tom Bower, whose approach was described as methodically unpredictable. Instead of emotionally charged drama, he relied on administrative details and documents that had remained hidden from public view for decades. The documents in question dated from the late 1990s and related to Meghan Markle's early career in the American entertainment industry. These documents contained a birth year that did not match the officially recorded year of 1981. 4 years' difference might seem insignificant in many walks of life, but in Hollywood, it's considered hard currency. Age determines one's perceived roles and how one is perceived. This was precisely the argument that made the case so explosive. Bower didn't focus on the moral judgment, but rather on the systematic nature of the discrepancies. If different information existed, it wasn't a coincidence, but a pattern. This perspective struck a nerve, as it suggested that this might not be a single mistake, but rather a deliberate adaptation to professional demands. What would previously have been interpreted as a pragmatic decision now appeared as potential deception with long-term consequences. The media impact was enormous. Newsrooms began scouring old archives. Industry experts weighed in, and legal professionals explained why such discrepancies might be tolerated in private settings but become problematic in institutional contexts. The timing was particularly sensitive. The allegations came at a time when the relationship between Meghan Markle and the British public was already delicate. Every new piece of information was immediately politicized and emotionally charged. Simultaneously, the tone on social media shifted. The discussion moved away from questions of appearance and toward a core issue: trust. Can a public figure who demands transparency live up to the ambiguities in her own biography? This question arose not only for critics but increasingly for previously loyal supporters as well. The silence surrounding the specific figures was more disconcerting to many than the figures themselves. It was particularly striking that the focus increasingly shifted to the transition from actress to duchess. With her marriage and entry into the royal family, the context had fundamentally changed. Private details became part of a state-relevant process. This was precisely the crux of the debate. Had the relevant authorities examined all the information, or had they relied on submitted documents without questioning previous statements? This uncertainty fueled speculation about possible shortcomings in the review process. Observers cautioned against jumping to conclusions, but the logic of the news cycles left little room for nuance. Each new headline reinforced the impression of a simmering problem that had previously only been superficially concealed. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on Kensington Palace. The institution faced a dilemma. A clear denial would have required absolute certainty. An admission would have had far-reaching consequences. The decision to initially remain silent was increasingly interpreted as a strategic move. But strategy alone could not make the open questions disappear. By the end of this section, it was clear that the debate had reached a new level. It was no longer about image management or media attacks, but about the stability of narratives that had been considered irrefutable for years. The documents had sown doubt, and doubt cannot simply be dispelled. How long could this state of limbo be maintained before one side would be forced to react openly? With each new headline, the pressure intensified, particularly on the institution that had hitherto been considered the last bastion of stability. The focus now clearly shifted to the palace and the question of whether and how it would react. Observers quickly realized that this was no longer a private matter, but a test case for how the monarchy would handle potentially damaging information from within a family member's inner circle. Prince William was at the center of attention. His role was viewed less as familial and more as strategic. As the future king, he embodied the responsibility for the institution's credibility. Every move, every word, every silence was analyzed and interpreted. While increasingly strong signals of protection and support were being sent from Meghan Markle's camp, there was growing concern within the palace about being forced into a defensive position that could ultimately cause more damage than the scandal itself. Public expectations were clear. Many expected a clear statement, either a confirmation or a denial. music, but therein lay the risk. A blanket defense would have meant implicitly, music, vouching for all aspects of Meghan Markle's past. An open distancing, on the other hand, would have been seen as a familial affront and would have triggered new accusations. This tension made the situation so delicate. At the same time, reports increased that narratives were being deliberately disseminated by people close to Meghan Markle. These accounts focused less on facts and figures than on feelings, perceptions, and the moral authority to interpret events. The debate became increasingly emotionalized. Critics were seen as heartless, supporters as blindly loyal. The palace thus found itself in the role of an actor that had to take a stance not only on facts but also on societal issues. Within Kensington Palace, the situation was apparently assessed dispassionately. Legal aspects, historical precedents, and the long-term impact on the monarchy's reputation were paramount. The principle of not airing conflicts publicly clashed with the modern media landscape, where silence is quickly interpreted as guilt. Nevertheless, it became clear that an emotional reaction was to be avoided. Prince William was seen during this period as the driving force behind a policy of institutional self-preservation. His stance was described as cool but consistent. The focus was not on personal loyalty, but on protecting the institution. This prioritization led to a clear demarcation. The palace's responsibility was to be limited exclusively to the information that had been officially submitted to it. For Meghan Markle and her inner circle, this development meant growing isolation. The hope that the palace would nip the accusations in the bud with a clear statement was not fulfilled. Instead, the impression arose that the institution was deliberately distancing itself. This approach was interpreted by some as a tactical retreat, by others as a calculated sacrifice. In the public perception, the narrative began to shift. The question was no longer whether the monarchy had to protect Meghan Markle, but whether it could afford to do so. This shift was crucial. It made clear that individual fates were secondary in this context when they clashed with the continued existence of the institution. At the end of this section, there was a tense anticipation. The fronts had hardened, the positions clearer. The palace seemed determined not to be driven into an emotional defensiveness. But how long could this balancing act be sustained? Would the strategy of restraint hold, or would it only increase the pressure and force an even more drastic reaction? When movement finally broke the rigid situation, it became clear that the palace had not remained silent out of uncertainty, but out of calculation. Behind closed doors, a strategy had long been developed that aimed less at public reassurance than at institutional self-protection. Observers described this moment as a turning point, where waiting became action, but not in the way many had expected. The decision that was ultimately made followed a clear logic: separation instead of defense. The palace was careful to legitimize its own procedures without identifying with Meghan Markle's personal past. This approach was interpreted as a so-called firewall strategy, a deliberate separation between the monarchy as an institution and the biographical details of an individual member who had only recently become part of that system. In the internal assessment, it was considered crucial that all documents examined in connection with the marriage had been formally correct. This allowed the palace to emphasize that it had acted according to the established rules without offering any further guarantees. This differentiation was subtle but effective. It allowed it to limit responsibility without overtly assigning blame. Prince William was seen as the architect of this approach. His role was less that of a mediator than that of a risk manager. For him, the personal relationship was not paramount, but rather the question of how much uncertainty the monarchy could tolerate without damaging its own legitimacy. The answer was clear. Any connection to unverified or contradictory information had to be severed. Public reaction to this strategy was divided. Some saw it as a cold, almost technocratic approach to a deeply personal crisis. Others recognized it as a decisive step intended to protect the monarchy from a vortex of speculation. Crucially, however, this stance shifted the discourse. The responsibility for clarifying the allegations no longer lay with the palace, but with Meghan Markle herself. This also changed the dynamics of media coverage. The media began to focus more on the lack of clear counter-evidence. The question of why certain documents were not made public gained importance. At the same time, the monarchy lost a target. Through this formal distancing, it had moved out of the direct line of fire. This development, however, came at a price. The distancing was interpreted by many as a signal that there would be no active support. For Meghan Markle, this meant a break with the expectation of being part of a protective system that had shielded other members of the family in the past. The difference was now obvious. Protection was for the institution, not necessarily for the individual. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the firewall strategy was not aimed at a quick resolution, but rather at long-term damage control. It left it to time and public discourse to process the open questions. But could this cool logic truly prevent the shadow of doubt from falling back on the monarchy? Or would this very distance be interpreted as a tacit admission of guilt? With a clear demarcation of the palace, the focus shifted once again. This time away from legal constructs and institutional declarations and toward the emotional arena. It became apparent at this stage that the conflict was no longer solely on the level of documents, but primarily in the realm of public perception. While the firewall strategy protected the monarchy, a vacuum emerged for Meghan Markle, which she attempted to fill with a different means: emotion. Instead of directly addressing the specific accusations, personal experiences, feelings, and societal interpretations moved to the forefront. The debate was reframed. The focus shifted from questions about birth years to issues like age discrimination, public pressure, and the harshness of media judgments. This shift was strategically astute, as it removed the discussion's objective foundation and placed it in a moral context where facts often become secondary. The media picked up on this development extensively. Commentators analyzed the staging less than the documents themselves. Tears, pauses, a somber tone. All of this was interpreted as deliberate dramaturgy designed to evoke sympathy. Supporters saw it as a legitimate expression of vulnerability, while critics viewed it as a calculated distraction from uncomfortable questions. The situation was clear. Emotions once again dominated the headlines. At the same time, a new front line emerged in the public debate. Anyone who continued to demand evidence risked being portrayed as insensitive or biased. Anyone who engaged on an emotional level became part of a narrative that interpreted structural criticism as a personal attack. This polarization led to the original core conflict becoming increasingly blurred. But this very strategy soon began to wear thin. The longer concrete answers were absent, the more frequently a simple question resurfaced. If the accusations are unfounded, why aren't they clearly refuted? This question gained weight because it couldn't be dismissed emotionally. It stood like a sober counterpoint to all appeals for compassion. During this phase, a shift also became apparent within the circles of support. While the loudest voices continued to demand unconditional solidarity, more moderate observers began to distance themselves. The feeling of being manipulated spread. Emotion alone could not permanently overcome the lack of transparency. To compensate, the media reacted accordingly. Reporting became cooler, more analytical. Instead of emotional headlines, questions of credibility and consequences once again took center stage. This development played into the palace's strategy, as it indirectly confirmed the assumption that time and restraint were more effective than swift counterattacks. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the emotional offensive had reached its limits. It had generated attention and mobilized sympathy in the short term, but it had not solved the central problem. The open questions remained, and with each passing day, the impression grew that they were being deliberately avoided. Could this form of communication be sustainable in the long run, or would it ultimately reinforce the very mistrust it was meant to dispel? As the emotional wave subsided, a phase began that is often more dangerous for public figures than the height of a scandal: a quiet reassessment. Without daily headlines, without a constant stream of outraged commentary, observers and business partners began to analyze the situation dispassionately. It was precisely here that the long-term impact unfolded. The doubts that had been triggered by the contradictory statements. The focus was now less on the question of guilt or innocence than on reliability. Music, brands, organizations, and partners that depend on trust and image react sensitively in such situations. The mere existence of an unresolved suspicion can be enough to reassess risks. In industries where credibility is considered capital, uncertainty is a warning signal. Accordingly, there were increasing indications of more cautious decisions and postponed projects. Public perception also changed noticeably. The discussions became quieter, but not less dangerous. Instead of emotional defense, skeptical undertones now dominated. The impression solidified that key questions had been deliberately left unanswered. This perception had a more lasting effect than any short-term wave of outrage, because it became ingrained in the collective memory. For the palace, this phase confirmed the effectiveness of the chosen strategy. Through the clear institutional demarcation, it had succeeded in shifting the focus away from the monarchy. Prince William publicly addressed issues that they had nothing to do with the affair, and therein lay the message. Normality and continuity signaled stability. The institution presented itself as unaffected, while the debate surrounding Meghan Markle was increasingly perceived as an isolated problem. This development, however, intensified the personal isolation of those involved. Without active protection from the institution, little room remained for controlled damage control. Every new commentary, every analysis latched onto the existing doubt. Even well-meaning voices could not prevent a persistent question mark from taking root. In the long run, it became clear that doubt does not need to be refuted to be effective. It is enough for it to persist. In this case, the combination of contradictory documents of institutional distance and a lack of clarification created a situation in which trust gradually eroded. The public grew accustomed to the idea that inconsistencies might exist, and this very habituation proved to be the greatest damage. In the end, a paradoxical result emerged. There was no official verdict, no formal condemnation, no clear conclusion. And yet, the picture had been permanently altered. The affair didn't explode, but rather slowly left its mark. The crucial question remained unanswered. Is the absence of a clear answer worse than any damaging revelation? The course of events offers a textbook example of modern scandal dynamics. What began with seemingly innocuous photographs developed into a debate about credibility, institutional responsibility, and the power of unanswered questions. The initial fixation on outward appearances quickly gave way to an examination of documents and administrative details that had far greater implications. The monarchy's reaction was decisive. Instead of an emotional defense, the palace opted for demarcation and formal clarity. This strategy protected the institution but shifted the entire burden of proof onto Meghan Markle. The subsequent emotional counteroffensive was able to mobilize sympathy in the short term but proved insufficient to dispel the core of the doubts. In the long run, it became clear that public perception thrives less on evidence than on consistency. The lack of clear answers led to a creeping erosion of trust that could be completely neutralized neither by emotion nor by silence. The affair didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet yet lasting echo. This leaves the future uncertain. Will the open questions ever be definitively answered, or will doubt remain a permanent companion? And what does this case reveal about how modern institutions deal with personal histories and public expectations? The answers to these questions likely extend far beyond this specific scandal.